We're going to be talking about the American reaction to being British colonists. First thing we need to know is that we are American colonists and not British colonists. You see, this is our timeline is 150 years after Jamestown. There's a lot of differences that have happened after or during this time. You see, the colonies grew into independent followers of the British Crown. So they were still under the British rule, but they were very independent in themselves. They wanted to do things their own way. Some talked about uniting together, as Ben Franklin did in 1754 with the Albany Plan of Union. But others knew it just wouldn't work out. You can't be united here. We're British. We need to stay British. We can't be a united group together. The interesting thing is most colonists in the New World had absolutely no ties with England. And many of these American colonists had even lost their accents. They didn't even sound British anymore, nor did they have any of the same British traditions that the people in England had. And so there were a lot of changes. And very few of these people had even been to England. It was only one of those things that a wealthy person could do, not just anybody. Anybody couldn't just go to England. So there were very few people that had even been to England and knew what it was like and had seen London and the castle and all of that stuff. So they're very American. And they're not British anymore. I do want to mention the Albany Plan of Union as mentioned by Ben Franklin. What he did was he invited representatives from New England, and he lumped New England all together as New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. And then he also invited some of the middle colonies together. And what he was doing was presenting ideas that the colonies could only survive if they were united. And he published this political cartoon to illustrate his ideas. And the statement, join or die, is one of the more popular political cartoons that especially the Star Test will use. But in referencing our uniting together to be a collective group focused on the same things, governing ourselves the same way, is really easily depicted by the severed snake here. I would like to talk about the relationship the colonists had with King George III. The thing about George was he struggled to keep order in his colonies. It was hard. He was so far away from the colonies that what he said maybe in January wouldn't get to the colonies until April or May. So there was a big time lapse between what he wanted and when it actually got done. So he struggled to keep order in his colonies. He feared that if he lost a few of his colonies, the others would soon fall as well. George had two main goals in keeping these 13 colonies together and under his control. His first goal was to tax the colonies to pay off the war debt. Now we're talking about the war the French and Indian War, and he is saying that the colonies owe him for protecting them in this war, and so he's trying to get as much money from the colonies as he can to pay off the debt incurred from that war. He's also using the colonies for mercantilism, and we'll discuss mercantilism in depth in a minute. King George also employed soldiers to ensure the colonists were abiding by his rules for daily living and especially trade. And that trade goes back to the mercantilism. Because of his overwhelming control, the colonists began to resent the king, and this is when they started thinking about rebelling. Maybe we can change the way things are. Let's discuss mercantilism. And in your notes, I would like you to draw this chart or graphic, the first thing I want you to notice is that the mother country, and this works for not only England and the 13 colonies, but for any country that is a mother country and has colonies in and of itself. The United States could be the mother country, and maybe Guam could be one of the colonies. But in our instance, we're talking about England and the 13 colonies here. So the mother country, it exploited the colony for their economic benefit. You see, the mother country would buy cheap lumber from these colonies, the English colonies, and they would build tables and chairs and other furniture things. And then they would sell it to the colonies for a higher price. But it's the colony's lumber that they're buying and selling. And then the colony existed only for the economic benefit of the country. You see, they would cut trees and sell that lumber cheaply to England. And then they would buy expensive tables and chairs from England. The thing about being the mother country is you could trade with anybody. And anybody could trade with you. And so if you can trade with anybody and anybody can trade with you and you can trade with the colonies, the idea behind mercantilism is that your colony can only trade with the mother country. And so in our instance, we have England here. And England is the only place that the colonies can trade with. The colonies cannot trade with France. They cannot trade with Spain or any of those other countries, South America even. They can't trade with any of those countries because they would be breaking the laws under the mercantilism with the mother country. And so mercantilism is a very important idea in that the colonies exist for the economic benefit of the mother country. No other reason. They are there to take their raw materials and resources and use them for the benefit of the mother country. Mercantilism is a great idea for the mother country. It's a terrible existence and idea for the colony. You do not want to be under mercantilism if you're in one of the colonies of a mother country. It's just no good for you. Great for them, bad for you. Okay? We have previously mentioned some of the taxes that have been imposed by the king. And we're talking about King George here. And after the French and Indian War, he issues the proclamation line of 1763. The reason behind this, and it's a fairly dumb reason, he's wanting to protect the colonists from the Native Americans. He's saying, guys, I'm doing this for your good, and so you will be safe. And so because I care for your well-being, I don't want you to move past the Ohio country and the Appalachian Mountains. Now, the fact of the matter is, if the colonists had moved that far away, they are just spreading themselves out, and that's not what the king wanted to do. Remember, he was starting to lose control. And so if those colonies started spreading out, he would lose even more control. He wanted to keep them all close together so he could control it easier. If you spread out, you can't control it very well. And so the proclamation line was all about control with the king. And because of the war, the French and Indian War, he started imposing taxes. And we will discuss some pretty important taxes. Now, if you looked in your timeline, there were 15 or 16 different types of taxes imposed by the king, but we're only going to mention some of the most important ones. The first one being the Stamp Act of 1765, and there's one of the stamps. You see, all legal documents had to have this official stamp. You could not buy playing cards. You could not have a lawyer present a will. You couldn't do anything, marriage certificate, without having this stamp on it, saying that it is official, you have paid for this document and this stamp. And so that was just one way the king was trying to get back some money that he lost in the war from the colonies. And during the Stamp Act, the idea of, I couldn't get my papers apart, of taxation without representation became really the motto of the colonists, because even though the Stamp Act might have been a good idea for the king, the colonists had no way to be represented in England. In the Parliament of England, in the lawmaking body in England called Parliament, colonists were not allowed to be there to give their part of the deal. They weren't able to give a say of what actually needed to happen in the colonies. They were really just left out, and the king, who thought he knew what was best, just started taxing. And so you'll hear very often taxation without representation in the colonies. And that's talking about there is no representation in England by the colonists. It was all English people living in England taxing the colonies. Excuse me. The next tax I want to talk about is the Tea Act of 1773. And this is where the king places a high tax on the tea that was imported into the colonies. You see, the colonies didn't grow their own tea at this time. They were importing it, or actually it was cheaper to import it than it was to grow their own. And so since Englishmen and British people drink tea very regularly, it seems like almost every day that they will stop and have tea, their afternoon tea. This was a big deal. It was a culture thing. And now the colonies were having to pay even more money for their tea. And it wasn't a good deal. And so as a result of the Tea Act, several colonists snuck onto a recently docked British ship and proceeded to dump many loads of England's tea into the Boston harbor. This is what we call the Boston Tea Party. Now, because of the Boston Tea Party, England imposed many more taxes that came to be known as the Intolerable Acts. Because they were intolerable, you could not tolerate them. That's what that word comes from. The Intolerable Acts was basically the last straw for the colonists. It seemed that the king couldn't tax them anymore or make their lives any more miserable. King George ended up closing the Boston harbor and would not allow the colonists to trade with anybody. It wasn't just with England, it was with anybody, period. You can kind of think about this as he was grounding the colonists. He was grounding his child for misbehaving. The colonists had messed up with the Boston Tea Party, and so he was grounding them to their room. It seemed irrational and uncalled for. The colonists realize that they are being mistreated by the king. And many people try to rebel against the king, but the soldiers that the king has placed in the colonies were there to stop any uprising. In 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred. And it was a result of the increased tension between the colonists and the well-established king's army. Other people rebelled by writing about separation. There's a guy named Thomas Paine who wrote a short pamphlet called Common Sense that encouraged colonial independence. Benjamin Franklin and a lady named Mercy Otis Warren and others anonymously wrote about separating from England. You see, the American reaction to being British is that we didn't want to be British at all.